Today's webinar will focus on equivalence frameworks as a possible solution to improve carbon markets functioning and climate mitigation potential. For background, about 70% of all countries and nearly 65% of the world's largest 2,000 public companies have either proposed or adopted net zero pledges. Even excluding pledges by subnational governments and other companies, these pledges together cover almost 80% of global GDP. To meet these targets, many nations and companies buy carbon credits on global carbon markets to offset their emissions. Carbon markets are built upon an assumption that each offset represents a ton of carbon dioxide or carbon dioxide equivalent emissions reduced or removed from the atmosphere. This assumption applies in the voluntary carbon market and the UN-backed Paris Agreement crediting mechanism, as well as in compliance markets that permit regulated entities to surrender carbon offsets to meet a portion of their compliance obligations. But there are reasons to doubt whether this assumption is true. Though present since carbon markets first emerged, concerns about offset integrity spiked in the early 2020s, fueled by journalistic exposés and peer-reviewed literature highlighting low-integrity offsets. In response, crediting programs that issue carbon offsets and stakeholder initiatives like the Integrity Council for the Voluntary Carbon Market have tried to restore trust by promulgating new integrity standards and updating project methodologies to align with those standards. But many remain skeptical that these reforms are enough to guarantee offset integrity. That brings us to the focus of today's webinar. If offsets are not truly fungible, one possible path forward is to adopt an equivalence framework to compare and value emissions reductions and removals with varying risks and uncertainties by calculating how many imperfect or risky offsets equal a perfect one. How best to measure equivalence requires careful consideration, and there are several possible frameworks either in existence or under development. Our panelists will discuss some of these equivalence frameworks and their consequences, as well as the potential for equivalence to improve carbon markets outcomes by honestly accounting for these markets' inherent risks and uncertainties. Policy Integrity Strategy Director Derek Sylvan will moderate today's panel. Our four panelists are Raimundo Atal, Economic Fellow at Policy Integrity, Ben Groom, Dragon Capital Chair of Biodiversity Economics at the University of Exeter, Sara Meyers, Chief Operating Officer for the Climate Institute of the Three Cairns Group, and Andrew Westgate, partner at the law firm DLA Piper. Thank you for joining us, and I'll now pass things off to Derek.
Thank you, Erin, and thank you everyone for joining the webinar today. As Erin mentioned, I'm the Strategy Director at the Institute for Policy Integrity, and I'll be moderating the discussion today. In just a moment, we will hear some initial remarks from the panelists, but first I just wanted to give one quick logistical note. You can ask questions at any point using the Q&A button at the bottom of the Zoom panel. We will be hearing some initial remarks from the panelists and then switching over to a discussion that will include some of the audience questions as part of that discussion. So feel free to submit those at any point. And we'll get things started today with some remarks from Andrew Westgate. He is a partner at DLA Piper. Andrew is an environmental transactions attorney and one of the leading experts on regulatory issues and contractual structures for carbon credits and other environmental attributes. He advises on the structuring, regulatory compliance, credit stacking, negotiation, and drafting of contracts for carbon credits, as well as carbon capture and sequestration, including corporate structuring for such projects. Andrew, go ahead.
Thanks, Derek. It's great to be here and speaking with everyone. So as Derek said, I'm the transactional attorney, and I do a lot of contract work in the carbon credit space, both for compliance programs, principally with California Cap and Trade, but also Washington Cap and Trade, and hopefully soon New York Cap and Invest, but also the voluntary market. And I've represented buyers, sellers, developers of carbon projects, and investors in carbon credits. And I also worked in-house at a fund that purchases carbon credits. So in my intro remarks, I'd just like to talk a little bit about what I see buyers generally looking for in carbon credits and what sort of contractual mechanisms they use to ensure credit quality and to address those issues. What do buyers want? Well, buyers need credits that can help them meet their climate goals. And I think there are two aspects to that are important. One, they need to meet a certain quality standard. Buyers, especially sophisticated buyers, and if you look at the composition of buyers in the carbon market, there is a concentration at the top. Some of the tech companies, financial institutions, companies with the resources, and generally a smaller physical carbon footprint are sort of leading the way in buying the highest quality credits and driving innovation in that space. And those companies have a very sophisticated view of quality and are looking at additionality and permanence. But the market as a whole is most concerned with meeting standards. What quality levels do I need in order to use these credits towards a net zero goal or towards whatever my climate commitment is? But in addition to quality, we also need a sufficient quantity of those credits. And the highest quality credits are a minority of the credits in the market. And one of the challenges is increasing the proportion of those credits that will be useful and actually accepted for climate goals. And the second part of the quantity aspect is that the standard setting organizations need to provide the methods and the places in which companies can use these credits to offset their emissions. And principally, I think Scope 3 is the biggest opportunity there, because the ability of many companies, except for the largest and most influential, to reduce their Scope 3 emissions in a very significant way can be limited. And they need to have some kind of option, and that is generally credits. For large buyers, they may also want to be able to sell or transfer on the credits after they buy them for a developer. They may want to offer them to their supply chain partners or their customers to reduce Scope 3 emissions, or just as part of managing the business. The bigger the buyer, the more they're going to be looking at long-term offtakes over many years and potentially large amounts of credits. And they may take on commitments to buy more than their expected needs and will want to pass them on. And that's one interesting aspect of the business, is that you can get contractual protection from quality issues, from reversal, from what call ineffectiveness often, which would be when the credits turn out not to have had the effect, not to have reduced carbon emissions, and have a contractual remedy against the buyer. But that's generally only when you are buying directly from the offset developer. If you're buying from a broker or from on the secondary market, generally the seller will not take on that kind of liability, because they don't control the offset project, and there are ongoing activities in terms of MRV, in terms of ensuring the permanence of the carbon offset that they cannot control. In terms of what buyers are most concerned about, I think less sophisticated buyers are very concerned about greenwashing. The more sophisticated buyers have already analyzed these problems, and I think the claiming net neutrality at the moment is kind of out of fashion. Most people have a long-term commitment but are not claiming to be carbon neutral at the moment. I think a bigger problem for long-term offtakes is counterparty credit risk and bankruptcy risk for the long term. If you have forestry credits that are supposed to have a 40-year sequestration period, the developer can go bankrupt in the interim. Many companies do not last 40 years. And then what does the offtaker do if they need to exercise their contractual remedies? Also counterparty risk, because most developers are small companies, and you can have this small offset developer entering into a 20-year offtake with a giant Fortune 500 company, and the offset developer is not creditworthy from the large corporation standards. So that's a challenge in terms of the risk that they'll breach the contract. In terms of what buyers are doing to address these risks, it's basically bespoke provisions in the contract if there is some kind of invalidation determination. And the real issue there is that there are no clear standards in the market right now for when a carbon credit has become low quality or been deemed ineffective to not actually reduce carbon. And to have an equivalence framework or even effective contractual mechanisms, there really needs to be a trusted, independent, third-party standard setter in the market that can say when a certain type of credit or protocol or a certain project's credits are no longer usable, or to diminish their value and decrease the amount of credit that can be taken for them. So back to you, Derek.
Great, thank you so much, Andrew. So next we will hear from Ben Groom. He is the Dragon Capital Chair in Biodiversity Economics at the University of Exeter. Ben has published in many of the world's leading academic journals, and his research focuses on a wide range of topics, including the economic value of offsets for carbon and biodiversity. He's also advised governments around the world on their approaches to long-term policy and investment in relation to environmental issues such as biodiversity and climate change. Go ahead, Ben.
Thank you, very kind. Nope. Apologies, hang on. There we go. I have a couple of slides, so I think we're there, yeah? Can you see my slides?
Okay. Yep, we see them. Thank you.
Yeah, great. I'm just going to continue then, right? Thanks a lot for the invitation. So I'm going to just present some of the work we've done on calculating the value of temporary removals. We were highly influenced by the work that was done looking at the additionality of tropical forest offsets. And so what we started thinking was, rather than removing those from discussion completely, we started thinking about what is actually the value of a temporary removal of carbon from the atmosphere, and what is the value of kind of impermanent, risky, and so on offsets. So we looked at the climate science, and actually, if you do kind of temporary removals, this is what happens to temperatures over time. You get a kind of relatively rapid reduction in temperature, and then when you re-release in like 50 years' time in this figure, in 2070, you get this return back to more or less back to where you were before. So this actually, in economic terms, is quite valuable because higher temperatures cause economic damages, and this is a temporary reduction in temperatures, which causes economic benefits. So that's kind of interesting logic to it all, and we came up with an interesting pricing formula that we called the social value of offsets. It looks like this, but basically what you need to know about this formula, without trying to understand all of the parameters, is that the SVO is a kind of well-defined fraction of the social cost of carbon. The social cost of carbon would be the value of a permanent removal of carbon from the atmosphere. And that well-defined fraction is determined by these kind of exponential terms on the right-hand side here, which depend on failure risk, duration, additionality risk, and so forth. And these the equivalence then can be thought of in terms of what fraction of the permanent removals damages does any given project represent. So you can take the SVO divided by the SCC. That might be 10%. If it's 10%, then you need 10 of those to be equivalent in this framework to a permanent removal. So it provides you with a kind of welfare, economic damage orientated equivalence framework. Key parameters that you need to estimate to measure this, of course, are sort of these failure risks and additionality risks. And the additionality risk is quite difficult to measure. We have some ex post estimates of this from the articles that were mentioned before in those top journals, which look ex post after doing kind of causal inference on the success of different tropical forest projects. But really, for the market, you need to have this ex ante. So in a separate set of work, what we did was we took the basis of additionality as being, if there's zero risk of deforestation, there's zero additionality. If there's 100% chance that deforested land will regrow, again, no additionality. And so that allows us to do a kind of thought experiment. We ran a machine learning exercise which did predictions of deforestation risk and regrowth for starting with Bolivia, extending to South America, and then started predicting areas where you get the most potential additionality. That is, if everything goes well, your conservation or your regrowth policy works 100% well. And on the left-hand side map here, you see the idea that any standing forest remains standing for 30 years. In the middle, it's anything that's deforested regrows perfectly for 30 years. And the shaded areas use the SVO formula to basically evaluate the additionality, using all of those risk parameters that we estimated in the machine learning exercise. On the right-hand side, you assemble both of these, and then you take away the opportunity cost of mainly agricultural production, and you're left with the key areas of high additionality in a dollar value terms per hectare. So you can see the kind of spatial configuration of additional areas. So that's pretty interesting, a helpful baseline for thinking through additionality in the market and sort of solving some of those problems that those other articles identified. Not only, though, do we need to think about risks in the context of tropical forests, but we need to think about it between different technologies as well. So here's a figure from the Al-Kadeh et al. Paper 2017 for the risks of geological storage leakage. This is a probability density function. At its peak, shows you the most likely level of percentage of loss from geological storage. And as you go out to the right in the tails there, you get the 90th and 95th percentile likelihood, worst case scenario losses. This is for an offshore implementation of geological storage. On the right-hand side, we have the onshore unregulated scenario that they present, where the losses are much higher. So the point here is that even geological storage has significant levels of risk that we need to be thinking about. And our proposal is one way in which we can sort of assimilate and make equivalent different projects with different levels of risk is to compare them in terms of risk statistics. We're proposing carbon at risk, so you could think about what is the 95th percentile risk of your particular technology or portfolio losing carbon. What that does is allow you to compare different projects in equivalent terms just on the basis of the risks of achieving particular removals target. And then you can compare different portfolios. So here's like every dot here is a different portfolio. The darker colors are cheaper, the yellow colors are more expensive. They're a combination of geological storage, of forest projects, of biochar in this particular. And you can think about the trade-off here between risk on the x-axis here, more risk on the right-hand side, higher expected values in the y-axis, and then the line at the bottom there is telling you, okay, below this, portfolios do not achieve a given removal of carbon with 95% certainty. So you can choose along this line, if you want, different types of portfolios that meet this particular risk. And they may be all forest projects, they may be all geological storage projects, they may be a mixture of the two. You may be diversifying amongst them. But the point is we need to be thinking about how we share the risk when we are evaluating different types of portfolio of carbon removals. Okay, that's my presentation. Thanks very much. I need to stop sharing. Sorry, hang on. There we go.
Thank you, Ben. Next, we will hear from Sara Meyers. She is Managing Director at Cairns Group. In previous roles, Sara has implemented large-scale cross-sector initiatives, including the CHIPS program at the U.S. Department of Commerce. She helped build and scale that $39 billion initiative to strengthen domestic semiconductor manufacturing. In her current role, she helps lead the development of the Atmospheric Impact Framework, an effort that aims to improve comparability of offset projects to support a scalable carbon market credit. Thank you, Sara.
Thanks so much for having me, and thanks for pulling this event together. I'm really excited to talk about our work on the Atmospheric Impact Framework, which is part of a suite of work that we do around carbon markets, including work around market infrastructure, public interest governance. But I'll start by saying, and I'll pull up slides in a moment, that what motivates all of what we do is figuring out how to build tools and solutions that can have real world climate impact. And we believe that carbon markets are one of the few mechanisms that we have that could efficiently channel private capital at scale. but that we are orders of magnitude away from where we need to be to have real impact. And that is at least in part because the system is missing several important features, among them fungibility, comparability. And so we are focused on trying to build, and we are very early days, a sort of a framework that allows for a common language or unit of account, and we call that the atmospheric impact framework. I believe you can see my slides, so I'm going to go for it. I won't belabor this because if you are registered, you already know this and are bought in, but credits issued in tons, the nominal ton belies, of course, underlying differences that are widely recognized, heavily debated, modeled, etc. And again, the reason that we care about this is because we think that the inability of market participants to understand relative impact, something that is core to many other mature markets, is a real barrier to participation and therefore scale. So what are we building? As I said, we're building what we call the Atmospheric Impact Framework, or AIF, grounded in research. The AIF converts heterogeneous carbon credits into comparable units of expected atmospheric impact. And while, of course, oversimplified on the slide, it does this by applying a structured set of quantitative adjustments to reflect the main drivers of real-world climate outcomes. And the output is a proportional value based on expected impact relative to a reference ton, and therefore a common unit, a common language for impact across very different activities that we think could have real value as a sort of tradable unit, but also in a regulatory context. I will, of course, not get into super into the weeds here, but a couple of key design features that I wanted to highlight. First is that there's sort of four analytical layers, which reflect the sort of buckets where we think the main drivers of uncertainty and variation actually arise. Each layer consists of a series of adjustment or conversion factors that are applied to projects. So from the project level and implementation to methodologies and assumptions to Earth system dynamics to economic system behavior like leakage. The second feature I'll call out is that when you see the output is partial credit. So rather than sort of having a binary in or out, you are sufficient quality or you are not. We have an AIF adjusted ton, again expressed in relation to a theoretical reference ton, and our view is that this is important because lots of projects, lots of different types of projects, as Ben was saying, have value. It's just they have different. They may not all reflect the exact same ton, and so how do you reflect that value, make it transparent to market participants or would-be market participants, recognize those differences explicitly, value them accordingly, and do that without excluding entire classes of projects. The third feature I'll highlight is that in the end, this is all intended to be fully transparent. So the methodology is the sort of scoring mechanics. We also envision, again, we're early days, but we envision sort of consultation periods in the future. And then the last thing I'll call out is that we envision this as a learning system. So it's not a one-time score. It is a score that as research evolves, the adjustment factors and criteria are updated to reflect the latest learning and knowledge. As I said, we're all about turning sort of theory into practice. And so we started this journey in earnest last year. We did a very small proof of concept in-house, and we are very fortunate to be working with a really diverse set of experts and thinkers, cross-disciplinary team, scientists, economists, academics, practitioners, public sector folks, to help us sort of pressure test this in what we're calling a minimum viable product, which will cover about 40 projects, about 20 project classes that we're hoping to deliver this year, and then move on into sort of a series of pilots. This is, of course, early days, as I said, a first iteration, but very much planning to keep this work moving forward. And finally, I'll just say, like, we see lots of applications for this common unit in today's world, in the fragmented landscape we have today across voluntary and compliance contexts. But if we are successful, our long-term vision is to make it easier for regulators to engage in carbon markets and really help drive demand. And we recognize that this is not incremental change. This is sort of a real structural, what we see as a bottleneck that limits market credibility and policy engagement. So while success may be a few clicks down the road, it really would look like orders of magnitude greater scale. Look forward to questions. Thank you so much.
Great, thank you, Sarah. So just a quick reminder that you can submit questions at any point through the Q&A button at the bottom. And our last initial speaker will be Raimundo Atal. He is an economic fellow at NYU's Institute for Policy Integrity. Raimundo's work combines economics, ecology, and applied engineering to study environmental, energy, and health policy questions. He holds a PhD in sustainable development from Columbia University, and one of his recent projects analyzes integrity and equivalence issues surrounding imperfect carbon offsets and the implications for carbon markets and net zero claims. Thanks, Raimundo.
Thank you, Derek. Can you see my slides?
Yep.
Great. Well, thanks for having me. I'm going to be talking about equivalence, and I'm going to be particularly focusing on claims, which is, and this work is part of a report that we published a few months ago that is available on our website. Let me start with a very short intro. So equivalence is, we want to calculate how many imperfect offsets are equivalent to a perfect one, and the goal is fungibility. And I see as one of the main objectives of this effort is to back up neutrality or net zero claims with a number of imperfect offsets. So a lot of the discussion regarding carbon markets have been about integrity concerns of credits and what they mean for, in some cases, claims that companies are making. There's interesting. There've been some interesting developments with some lawsuits for companies that have been questioned regarding their neutrality claims with when they use credits. So the market and researchers, everyone is in the search for an answer to how do we combine the fact that offsets are imperfect with something that has value for companies to make claims towards and countries too for their goals. So ensuring permanence has been ensuring integrity, and permanence is one of these of the components of integrity, has been the cornerstone of the market. So how the market is organized, and all the integrity concerns have put a little bit on question whether that is a reasonable goal. And I personally think that looking for equivalence metrics acknowledges that there are risks, inherent risks of carbon offset, and it's a more realistic and transparent approach than trying to ensure that an offset is perfect, right? For example, via buffer pools, insurance, etc. So in this question of what they mean for claims, so equivalence built on physical terms have important limitation for claims, and I'm going to explain here what I mean for that. So physical claims, physical terms have to do with concerns regarding CO2 that is in the atmosphere, or temperatures, or global warming potential, as opposed to social damages, as Professor Groom was mentioning. So my point is that imperfect offsets over the long run have null impacts in physical terms. And let me put an example. So if you have a project that sequesters 1 ton of CO2 for 50 years and 1 ton of CO2 for 100 years, there are 0 tons sequestered after 100 years. And this is what Professor Groom was showing in his slides. So after the emissions are emitted in the atmosphere, the impacts on CO2 concentration, temperatures, global warming potential are null. Okay, and the time frame here is the most relevant one, right? Because we want to claims are supposed, or offsets are supposed to back up a actual a claim, an offset claim that is against an emission in the atmosphere that lasts for hundreds, if not thousands of years. So the relevant time frame is hundreds, if not thousands of years. So what the above example shows is that because imperfect offsets over the very long run, which is the time frame that we care about, have null impacts, you cannot build a neutrality claim based on these physical outcomes. Okay, so and this is very relevant for the ability of firms to first of all, the fungibility of imperfect offsets into one that is perfect, and then for the claims that can be performed with this number of imperfect offsets. Now, this does not mean that imperfect offsets are worthless. Quite the contrary. And again, as Professor Groom was saying, imperfect offsets have social value. And when the benefits are greater than their costs, they should be pursued. One of the benefits of imperfect offsets is that they delay emissions. And I'm an economist. We care more about things in the present. So delaying emission has a value. They also avoid tipping points, and these are extremely relevant points. And so what are the options moving forward? Well, you can actually think of equivalence calculated over the social damages using the framework that Professor Groom was presenting. But that means that the claim is not on physical neutrality, right? When you calculate equivalence with that sort of framework, but of some sort of damage neutrality, right? In terms of the physical, the social cost. Another option, and these are things that we expand on the report, is to actually agree on a level of risk that is acceptable to claim that the full cancellation of emissions. There's some precedent on this. For example, the IPCC has language to present the uncertainty structure of the results, and that could be a guidance on how stakeholders in this market can agree on what is a level of risk that is acceptable to claim the full cancellation of emissions. A third option would be what some authors have called a contributions framework, which essentially means letting go of neutrality claims, but that firms actually contribute through carbon markets to projects that have environmental benefits, but do not claim a certain amount of tons of reductions. In general, there's a lot of in the literature, a lot of people claim that we shouldn't let the perfect be the enemy of the good, and I think that's a very good approach. But at the same time, and I think this is one of the problems that the carbon markets have had in the past years, that we shouldn't let the imperfect appear as perfect. That's it for me.
Great, thank you so much, Raimundo. So we will now turn to our discussion and Q&A section. So thank you to those who've already submitted some questions. Feel free to keep doing that. I'll start with one of the audience questions, since I think it does a good job of kind of teeing up the sort of nature of this discussion. So we have a question, and also panelists can feel free to turn on cameras and microphones now. So we have a question asking, haven't these questions already been addressed in negotiations conducted under the umbrella of the UN framework on climate change? For example, REDD+ credits. Why are we kind of revisiting this equivalence question that has obviously been thought about quite a bit over the course of the kind of development of these carbon markets? And anyone who wants to start is welcome to.
I mean, so if you don't mind, I'll start with that one. Yeah, so it's a very good point, and yes, these discussions have been rolling on for a good spell. I would say that the way in which equivalence has been discussed before, as Raimundo was talking about, has not really captured the essence of the climate science on the one hand, but also risk on the other. And so I think the sort of latest contributions, ours is not the only one. There's a bunch of really nice pieces of work out there which are actually orientated much more to the market framework than the Red Plus framework. Mean that what we're doing, I think, is sort of novel. But I certainly agree that we're standing on the shoulders of the discussions that happened in that particular forum before.
Sure. Anyone else want to address any part of that? I guess I'm curious to get, from anyone who's interested, your sense of how stable is the status quo in the voluntary market, given some of the risks that we've talked about and some of the concerns that buyers have and coverage of this market and criticism. What factors do you think are most likely to spur significant changes, or do we think that is a situation that is not likely to change in a serious way in the near term?
I'll answer. I think the market is at a tipping point. The reduction removal market trading has not grown. The market has been kind of stagnant. All of the attention is on removals, which are a much smaller piece of the puzzle. And if carbon credits are going to make a difference in the next 10 years, it has to be in the reduction space, because we have 50 billion tons of emissions. Removals are not a significant part of the equation yet. That's the value in the near term. So something has to be done to make those credits usable by buyers and increase that demand. So I think part of it is that there has to be a quality standard that cuts off a significant part of the market towards the bottom. So something like the core carbon principles, it has to be large enough that there's still a supply of credits that can be useful in the market, but it also has to make a meaningful cut to get rid of the lower quality credits, or somehow diminish their utility in the market, diminish the amount of credit that can be taken for them, that will allow the market to coalesce around a higher standard. And I think a lot of the efforts have cut off too small a piece at the bottom.
I mean, my reflection, being, I think, newer to this space than the other panelists, is that, I mean, it certainly seems like the market has shrunk and diverged in really interesting ways, and that there's sort of camps that are dug in on nature-based versus engineered solutions, and what you can really understand about quality. I think if you ask me, and maybe this is my bias as a formerly lifelong government person, that like the fastest way to get action is through governments taking action in a variety of ways, here or elsewhere, is really like the biggest lever that you have. And of course, we're in quite a fragmented state on that front today.
Sure. Ben or Raimundo, anything to add on that question?
So I approach this as sort of a non-expert in the market itself, just as a kind of an academic exercise in thinking through how markets work in general. And it strikes me that yes, the tipping point point that Andrew made seems about right. That it could go either way, and this market could completely unravel, or if the right interventions are made on the institutional side, it could work pretty well. So what would those right interventions be? Well, I see the SVO thing that I presented and the other kind of contributions in this area. What they really require is transparency in the data side. So we need to know much more data about the success and failure of different projects and different approaches that have taken place in the market than we currently have. The formula that I mentioned is really just a way of measuring quality. What is the quality of these different contributions here? And without understanding the quality side of things and underpinning that with some sort of institutional structure, which is based on agreed principles of measuring additionality, coupled with the transparency on measurement, I think we're just going to muddle along as we have done before. So yeah, that's my view on this, really.
My personal take, I mean, I've seen an interesting shift. Again, I've been focusing a little bit on the claims side of things. How firms are actually, some firms are in this gray zone where they buy credits, but do not claim the emission reductions or the offsets of their emissions. I'm not gonna give names, but I've seen in scope emissions reports, right, the actual emissions, and then on a column next to it, the amount of credits that been bought, but there's no claim on whether these are actual offsets. And to me, that's an interesting sign that there's an extreme care and I'm on how to approach still this space. Maybe a sign of what Andrew was mentioning of this tipping point, whether this guy is going to move one way or the other. It's a matter of speculation to me at this moment. But I also agree that there's need to be radical improvements in data transparency. Methods are extremely hard to understand, and the institutional framework, it's in my opinion to this day insufficient to overcome all of the concerns that have been in discussion for many years now.
Sure. So there are a number of observers and researchers who have repeatedly pointed out the way that potentially misaligned incentives among various market participants drive some of the offset integrity problems that have been mentioned today. So for instance, crediting programs that earn a per credit fee from project developers might be subtly motivated to overissue credits. To what extent do you all think equivalence will solve those kinds of misaligned incentive problems?
I don't think equivalence alone solves the incentive problem. I mean, for something like the per credit issuance fee, I think that is always going to be an incentive to issue more credits, right? I think there you have to look to the robustness of the methodology and whether the way that it specifies quantification is really defensible, and proof is in the pudding.
I would agree that the equivalence itself does not necessarily address some of those perverse incentives, but or some of those sort of misaligned incentives rather. But I do think that we have been thinking about what are the ways in which you might have gating mechanisms to say you actually don't make it through the scoring if you don't have the following conditions in place. How might you try to grade or evaluate the sort of quality of audit and stuff like that? At present, we're not considering including that, except as sort of a gating mechanism. I think the other way is that we are trying to be very thoughtful in the construction of the framework we're working on, is how to make sure that in the governance of the framework itself, that you don't embed new sources of conflict, and that you don't sort of recreate some of the problems we've seen in the past.
Sure.
I would add that, if I may, for this to work properly, we need really robust ex ante understanding, ex ante definitions of additionality that can be part of any kind of contractual arrangement. But then we also need ex post analysis, which should also be an agreed part of any contractual arrangement. I think in the past, particularly with the RED Plus and the CDM and that kind of those kind of approaches in the past, they were like perpetual contracts, right? Oh, we're going to do this and it's going to happen forever. And then there were no institutional arrangements there to make sure that these were durable removals or emissions reductions or whatever, right? So I think that I agree with Andrew's comment earlier on that a lot of the solution to all of this is in terms of the incentive. Yes, you need the kind of quality measures in the background. Yes, you need the checks and balances in terms of additionality, but you also need a kind of reasonable contractual arrangement that allows us to check in at intervals on projects to make sure that they're doing more or less what they said they were going to do. If they're doing less, then we need to recheck. If they're doing more, then there should be, there's an opportunity for recrediting, having high levels of credits there. But the checking in at intervals is super important for additionality, and I think short-term contracts are much more realistic and comfortable for us, and we're used to them in legal terms, than sort of perpetual contracts.
Sure. So on the demand side, if we imagine that the market does at least some significant level adopt an equivalence framework, possibly one of the ones that we've talked about here, or something similar, how do you all think this might affect corporate buyers' incentives to participate in the voluntary market? Is that going to have a significant effect? And if so, what do you see it looking like?
I think it could have a big effect. I think it right now, if a corporation is committed to a certain quality standard, they have no use for anything that's under that standard. And we look at something that has, it's over credited by 25% low quality, and there's no differentiation between that and something that has removed nothing or has no additionality whatsoever, and it will allow a lot of bad credits that still have value to clear the market. I think it makes it much easier for something like carbon insurance to happen, where you can insure the risks on a long-term basis, because the insurance company will be able to assemble a portfolio, and it won't have to worry about that portfolio, half of it becoming completely unusable. It will be a downgrade, a diminution in the value, and that's something that's much more, it's understandable terms. They know how to deal with an investment that loses value.
I second all of that. I think it's sort of like, it also lowers barriers to participation for companies that don't have giant diligence teams and aren't going to do the sort of brain damage to figure out whether an investment is worth making. I think it helps with sort of internal decision making. It makes it easier to make that the case to your CFO. I totally agree on the portfolio construction, and I think that like together these dynamics are what can support robust secondary markets, financial intermediation, which we think are sort of limited by the lack of comparability today.
I would add, so it depends how you use the equivalence sort of idea in all of this. So if you use it as a way of thinking through, okay, this one thing, we need to buffer this with insurance policies, which and now we know the risk of this particular project. That's one way of doing it. Another way of doing it is saying, well, this thing, if it's equivalence is 0.1, you need 10 of them, and that's the contract that we're going to have in terms of removals, so that on average at the end of the contract it achieves something that's equivalent in the way we've described it as a permanent removal. Then that affects the market in a different way, because basically that means it's 10 times more expensive. You need 10 of them. That thing is 10 times more expensive, and actually that might reduce the incentives to buy kind of low quality offsets and so on. So, and that's actually a signal we want, right, in the market. I would have thought, but it depends how you set this up, and like what Andrew described is another perfectly reasonable way of organizing the market, and it depends like who's bearing the liability who's bearing the risk effectively, right? So, but either way, the equivalent idea can help you think those structures through.
Sure. And so I guess in addition to that sort of corporate demand consideration, wondering to what extent you all think the equivalence frameworks that we've discussed are compatible or incompatible with some of the carbon credit transactions that you expect to see under Article 6 of the Paris Agreement. Like when we get to that sort of national level, is it any different in terms of demand with, once an equivalence framework might be layered on top of the current market?
I'm by no stretch of the imagination an expert on Article 6, just to name that. But my understanding is that like the when there are still if there are still going to be sort of multiple regimes and sort of national approaches, then a translation layer could theoretically be useful. I think that's sort of as far as I can go on that question.
Sure.
Oh, Raimundo, do you want to go first?
Sure, briefly. So articles, the provisions in Article 6 relate to physical emission reductions. So my bet would be that physical equivalence comparison would be more appropriate. And that's what we're all used to, right? So there's targets based on physical emissions, and equivalence should go and support that. But I guess as a conclusion of what I was trying to convey, there will have to be some type of understanding about what are the levels of acceptable risks, and understanding that imperfect offsets are prevalent. So in that sense, my anticipation is that it's going to be more physical. It will be a physical equivalence, but with some sort of I would call it like a social contract on how much risk are we willing to accept to claim that countries, firms, etc., are actually meeting the targets that are being set.
The only thought I want to add is that I feel like an equivalence framework is more likely to take hold in the private sector than for Article 6 between nations. I just think that the quantities involved, the fact that it's so concentrated in nature-based solutions because of the quantities involved, and I think getting an agreement on what types of credits would be affected by the equivalence framework would be that much thornier in that context.
So I think I might agree with that. And in principle, there's no difference just because it's a global market. It should be just and global trading is proposed. I don't think it makes any difference. But in principle, in practice, I think you're probably right about that, Andrew. One thing that would be one thing that we ought to be very careful of is the introduction of kind of risky stuff into compliance markets. Many of the compliance markets work very, very well. And part of the reason that they work very well is that the institutional setup they have, but people sort of believe in them, right? They believe in the trading system and the permits and the integrity of those permits. And one wouldn't want to water that down, given that it works pretty well. So I would not, in terms of compliance markets, I would be kind of very careful to make sure the institutional setup is very, very crisp before we start introducing, let's say, tropical forests offsets into the EU ETS or something like that. Yeah.
I'm actually glad you brought that up, because I think compliance markets are a great place for equivalence frameworks to take hold, because then you have the regulator to be that entity that gets to make those decisions about which credits get devalued, and that fiat power is already there. It's not like the market has to coalesce around, we're going to trust this agency.
All right. Thank you all. So we have an audience question that gets into some of the social dimensions of some of these offset projects. So the question is, to what extent do these equivalence models also integrate issues of safeguarding as part of the standard to which the credits are issued? So things like free, prior, and informed consent, land rights, other rights-based aspects of program rules and standards. Can you, for anyone who's interested, talk about how a uniform assessment of those kinds of aspects might be implemented into these standards? I guess, Sara, maybe do you want to start with how the AIF is, kind of taking social aspects of these offsets into account?
Sure. I mean, the short answer is that they largely do not. And the reason for that is because our sort of output is a fractional ton. There's a whole range of like really important social and co-benefits that are just not included in our framework, which does not mean that we do not value them. It means that they are like a separate matter. And so when we think about this work, we think about the sort of AIF adjusted ton as existing alongside any number of other sort of markers of quality and impact that a buyer might be interested in. But our work is like pretty narrowly focused on sort of atmospheric impact expressed in tons of CO2e.
Sure. Raimundo, I know, or Ben or Raimundo, I know that you both have talked and written about some of these issues. You want to say anything more on that?
I think there's another question here about sort of related issues as well. So I think like in economics, I'm sort of I'm an economist, so I think a bit narrowly, I suppose, in many respects. But we're often accused of sort of saying of just putting a number on everything and valuing everything and doing cost benefit analysis as if it's the only thing. And like to some extent, we are, that is our job to do this sort of thing. But we don't do cost benefit analysis outside in a vacuum, outside of a rights-based system. We do not do cost benefit analysis on things which transgress, say, human rights, and we don't think about projects which use child labor or et cetera, et cetera. So there is a framing within which the equivalence framework is valid, and I think Sarah was saying before, other issues concerning kind of the effect on communities in tropical forest areas, for instance, is a more of a red line issue that determines whether or not you go ahead with the valuation in the first place. So I think that's my view. And then at that point you start thinking about, okay, so if this is going to be so bad, how can it be improved, or et cetera, et cetera.
I think that's also how corporate buyers view it. I think quality issues in terms of overcrediting or additionality, leakage, those can be discounted in a buyer's mind, but something like human rights violations, things with indigenous peoples, those are just due diligence issues that you want to identify in advance and run away from when you find them.
Sure. And then I guess a somewhat related question, are there ways that positive co-benefits, things like, biodiversity improvements, positive community outcomes, can or should be reflected in equivalence frameworks? Are there ways that, the sort of marketplace could benefit from a better understanding of those positive co-benefits? And if so, how might that look?
My impression that's a incredibly hard question. So because you're comparing things that are in a sense of very different dimensions and put them all of them in a single indicator. That has always been a extremely challenging thing to do. In part because you have to consider the weights that you're going to give to each dimension into a particular indicator. But I think that those are like critical questions to the extent, for example, forestry projects, for a lot of forestry projects, for example, rely on exotic monocultures. And the social value of an exotic monoculture is probably lower than of having a native biodiverse forestry project. How to capture those in an equivalence framework, I think it's extremely challenging. I wouldn't have an answer to that, but I think they're critically important. Probably a social value framework is more prepared to deal with these things to the extent that they can turn biodiversity effects into monetary values, thinking about valuing different ecosystem services, and so on. But that's an extremely challenging but important thing to do.
I like the idea of separate frameworks a lot, because I think it's important to focus on the environmental integrity and the climate impact as one separate characteristic of the credit, and then co-benefits. They could be thought of separately, but they also could be thought of together. I often, for people who are just entering the market, analogize the carbon credit to wine. They come in the same size bottle. It's supposed to be a ton, but the value can vary wildly based on all of these sort of softer, less well-defined characteristics. What are the tasting notes? And those are the co-benefits. And especially for nature-based solutions, oftentimes that could be the majority of the value.
Sure.
I mean, for sure, we want to be able to distinguish between two projects which provide the same amount of carbon, one of which is providing a huge amount of ecosystem services and biodiversity benefits, and the other of which isn't. I would have thought we would want to do that. Whether we've, of course, and I expect that if I knew how to value biodiversity in the same way as I know how to value climate damages in a kind of reasonably systematic framework, I would already have a value for you in my formula. But the difficulty is we don't know how to do that particularly well. Ecosystem services are one thing, and biodiversity is a completely other, and that's really, really tough. But anyhow, I like the wine analogy that sort of there's a quality issue here, and in terms of flows of finance to supply, people providing these global public goods, we might want to think about stacking these benefits together. If people can provide both of these things, then maybe they're providing greater social value, global value. Then the more, in some sense, more finance should be flowing towards that. So, yeah, that's my view.
Great. So, some of you touched on some pieces of this with the opening question, but what do you see as the most important potential regulatory or structural changes that might govern the issuance and purchasing of carbon credits in the near future? Are there any sort of changes along those lines that you can foresee, and are stakeholders anticipating those changes in a meaningful way that you've noticed?
I'm very curious for Andrew's view on what people are anticipating. I think, obviously I don't have a crystal ball, but my sense is that people are anticipating further action on disclosure, on CBAM measures, and obviously, like, the pace at which all of that unfolds depends on where you are. And so you're sort of left with a really fragmented set of rules, and governments developing policy at different pace. And I can imagine, if I'm a company, like, that's a challenge. You're sort of anticipating what's to come. And if you're a multinational, you're anticipating what's to come in various places and trying to make that sort of work for your overall business, without having too many different models. So, I think that there's a lot of levers, whether it's around disclosure or border adjustments, or just straight up caps, new compliance markets, etc. But the thing that strikes me the most is just that, like, there's just real fragmentation and difference by place.
Yeah, I think in terms of, like, private sector voluntary market developments, people are looking at things like core carbon principles and SBTI, and when will there be clarity on what companies can use carbon credits for now that is a permissible use and is not some kind of greenwashing. And I think the most likely place is in scope 3 emissions, where many companies have a very limited ability to influence how their suppliers conduct business. And if you say that they can, for meeting their 2030 goal, they can use 50% offsets for scope 3, that allows them to take action, still provides a impetus to push their suppliers for direct action, but also provides a place for carbon credits. Another thing I'm looking at is when there's a framework specifically for removals in compliance programs. I think that the EU is going to be developing that, and California is also going to be developing that. They haven't done it formally in the rulemaking that was just announced, but their 2045 goal is going to allow 33 million tons of emissions every year, and currently they have that in the allowance budget as they're going to issue allowances in that year. But I guarantee that's not going to happen. They can't issue allowances. It has to be a removal credit if it's actually going to be carbon neutral. And 33 million is an enormous number. I think they're going to have to start requiring a portion of compliance obligations, 1% in 2030, something like that ramps up because you can't go from 0 to 33 million. There aren't that many credits in the world, let alone California right now.
I would add very briefly to that. And so the UK has already has some guidelines on how it's going to handle its own. Because of Brexit, we have our own ETFs now, which anyway, but that's a different story. But they have guidelines on the inclusion of removals as well. And I think the French are thinking this through as well as part of the ETFs. But there's also a few proposals from very eminent economists like Rohini Pandey, who's at Yale, and so on, to create sort of compliance type, turn the voluntary carbon market into a compliance type market. So you just handle the whole voluntary stuff in that compliance framework, which seems reasonable in many ways, although it would require all of the institutional integrity that we've discussed as well in this meeting to make that work. But that might be another way forward, to kind of contain that and have clear cap and trade requirements. That's another way of, I think, of saying what you were saying about the SBTI, like having some clarity on what's allowed and what isn't. Yeah.
Great. So I think we have time for maybe two more roughly. One, maybe you can start with the economists on this. As we've talked about with the wine analogy and some of the other comments, carbon offset prices currently vary widely based on project sector, location, and other factors. But the market is structured around selling credits that are equal to 1 ton of CO2 removed or avoided. How do you envision the sort of longer term future market? Do you see that price heterogeneity persisting, or do you think that there could be a point where markets integrate and the prices sort of come close to equalizing across projects? And if you think that latter option is superior, what kind of adjustments, including some of the equivalence efforts that we've talked about here, do you think are kind of most important to get there? Raimundo or Ben, any initial thoughts on that, or others are obviously welcome to jump in.
I can say something. To the extent that heterogeneity in other dimensions of the projects persists, let's say like biodiversity, prices would be different. Going back to the wine analogy, a carbon sequestration project that delivers no biodiversity benefits and so on should be price at a lower than another one that does provide better habitat or enhances biodiversity. In both scenarios, so whether like strict, I mean, I'm not going to repeat what have been said already, but very clear and strict regulatory frameworks need to be in place to be able to develop these things in one way or the other. So I don't think that changes too much the requirements for the long term.
Yeah, I mean, at the moment, I think there could be many reasons for this. I mean, one reason might be that there is not a single market for these different types of provision. I mean, they do cost different amounts, and the demands for, let's say, direct air capture coming from a completely different part of the market to the ones which for sort of forest removals, I would have thought, right? So that the kind of big tech companies are sort of really focused in on the technological solutions, I understand. And yeah. So there are kind of different markets happening there, but also there's this quality issue. And but the fact there's such heterogeneity in the prices just shows you that the market's not really working particularly. One argument could be that the market's not working particularly well on the quality side to differentiate quality.
I would, not an economist, but would second that. And just like my understanding is that like prices today reflect mostly the cost of production and the narrative, but not actually the underlying value. And that makes sense because there isn't this sort of translation comparability mechanism to help us understand what the value is. And so that's where I think an equivalence framework actually really does help, but the heterogeneity in price will exist because because of all the people value biodiversity and other things that are not sort of a part of the sort of atmospheric impact that the equivalence framework might try to get to.
Sure.
I kind of think like whether the market grows or shrinks, prices are going to go up over time for a couple of reasons. If it shrinks, we're going to get rid of all the avoidance and reduction credits, and it's going to be only the fancy technological solutions, which are expensive. I think, compliance markets are all designed to drive the carbon price up over time. And right now, I think it's mostly too low for the climate. In California, the carbon allowance is a little over $30. I don't think that's the marginal cost of abatement for your average emitter in California. It's nowhere near the social cost of carbon. And I think quality is, if the voluntary market doesn't go away, quality is going to increase because we're going to learn more about what the actual retained carbon is, and we're going to get better quality standards, and that's going to impose more requirements on the developers and increase the cost of production. And it can't go below the cost of production, but I think we do need to recognize more of the value, and the more credits can be integrated into a compliance type program or effectively become a compliance requirement. If you needed to have a net zero goal to access bank financing, that might be a way for the private sector to do it. Then that's going to increase the demand and prices will go up.
Sure. Thank you. So I think I have time for one last sort of lightning round question that we can try to get each of you to weigh in on, which is, what do you see as the most important area for future research or data gathering that could improve the carbon markets? If you could pick, one or two things in that, that we would be able to learn in the near term, what might that be? Anyone want to start us off?
I'll do some quick hits. I think improving our understanding of sort of time and durability, and how you can, for the purposes of comparison, in a way that's both sort of scientifically grounded, operationally usable. Also, under better understanding sort of system level effects, including things like leakage, especially if the market were to scale dramatically. And then the last thing I would say is closing the loop between market activity and actual atmospheric observation. Again, in a scenario where you were scaled significantly, how do you actually connect those things are things that we're thinking a lot about.
Thank you.
So in economics, I think that the interesting stuff would be in terms of applying some contract theory to understanding what the best contractual forms are, which don't lead to perverse outcomes. Because it's easy for me to say, oh, we should have these short-term contracts and we revisit every so often. Actually, I'm not a contract theorist, so I don't know exactly what the unintended consequences of that might be. It just seems intuitively right to me. But this has not been looked at in the context of the VCM and so on. So I think that's an interesting area of research going forward. And then, yes, this is not an area of research particularly, but I'm very interested in keeping up with how agreement arises on evaluation of additionality over time. This has to be the crisis of recent years is based on, some quite strident findings on non-additionality. So I think that the advances on the institutional side there, how that plays out, I think is going to be super interesting.
This reflects more of a personal interest, but I've been very curious to know some metrics of co-benefits. I've been interested in forestry projects and what they deliver in terms of other benefits. And I know these are present in registers, some measures that could be systematized by scraping those. I'll be very interested in constructing a database that allows to get at least some sense of how the fraction that every forestry project is devoting to exotic species or native versus native species and so on. So that would be a personal treat.
I would second that, kind of the biodiversity dimension here in the context of the carbon market that has to be nailed somehow. So that's really interesting. But then also there's this whole parallel world of biodiversity credits, which needs to be handled as avoiding the mistakes of the carbon market as well. So I think that's another area.
Great.
I would say monitoring, reporting, and verification. Just the idea that we don't have the right models and we aren't looking at the correct data, to assess whether carbon stays sequestered for 10 or 40 or 50 years is kind of very worrying as you're writing up these contracts. So if we could get a coherent framework around that everyone agreed on and felt reasonably certain, I think that would be a powerful catalyst for the market.
Great. Thank you all so much. Huge thank you to all of our panelists for a really interesting discussion today. I want to put in a very quick plug before we break for some of the Institute for Policy Integrity work on the carbon markets. For any of you who are interested, we have reports on U.S. federal regulatory authority over the voluntary carbon markets, an explainer report on how these markets work, the report that Raimundo worked on equivalence and perfect offsets. So I encourage you to check out some of our work on these issues if you're interested. I also wanted to quickly thank Matt Fleck and Don Goodson, my other colleagues, for their help in putting this together. Thank you so much to everyone who joined and to our panelists, and have a great rest of your day.